The Ancient View of Man as a Political Animal, Lecture 1. In the last lecture, I gave an overview of this course, talking about how we would study the American political order in light of enduring questions from political philosophy about the best way to order a community towards the common good. Now, since this is a course on the principles of American politics, you might wonder why we are starting then with Aristotle, going back a few thousand years instead of starting with America. And the answer is fairly simple. Oftentimes, the things that we are most familiar with, we don't truly understand because we're so used to them that they're just kind of taken for granted as part of our environment. Oftentimes, one of the best ways to get to know your own culture or your own political order is by being able to compare it with the experience of another, of living with people who truly think differently, living in a society that truly is run differently. So, in other words, an important part of coming to really understand how things are is comparison, is broad exposure to other ways. And so within political philosophy, I think this is especially important because American politics and American political principles are relatively recent in human history. And there's a long tradition of political practice and political philosophy that exists prior to America. And going back to Aristotle, I think is especially helpful for studying American politics because if you think about it, the most famous political writing, I'm sure, of an American is the Declaration of Independence. And the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence lays out in an abstract way certain principles that the country has been dedicated to, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? And that when government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have the right to alter or to abolish the government and replace it. Now, those are famous lines from American history. If were Aristotle to hear the Declaration of Independence, his response would be, nope, 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 right? Created equal? Nope. Natural rights? Nope. Right to liberty? Nope. Government exists to secure rights? Nope. Legitimate government must have the consent of the governed? Nope. Aristotle wouldn't agree with any of that. So Aristotle is not only a prominent philosopher, but he represents a fundamental alternative to our kind of modern way of thinking about liberal democratic government and the proper ends of government, securing individual rights, equality, liberty, and the like. So Aristotle is really helpful because he's kind of like the classical understanding or a statement of the understanding of politics as being concerned with the highest ends of human life, in Aristotle's case, virtue and happiness. He is the aristocratic voice, the one that argues that the best way to organize society is the rule of the virtuous few for the sake of the virtue of all. And that those who aren't the best, their proper station is to obey those who are the best for their own good. So no equal rights, no consent of the governed. Now, Aristotle's political philosophy is more complicated than that. I'm giving a very basic overview. But so we turn to Aristotle in order to see at a high level the political philosophic defense of aristocracy, a regime that is not based on equality and is not based on an ideal of universal individual liberty. So there are two edited readings that I've given you in the packet, some selections from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is his treatise basically on virtue and the good life, and then some selections from his Politics, which is his philosophical analysis of different political orders, the purpose of politics, the nature of citizenship, and all that kind of stuff. And so in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the ethics, because the ethics really kind of sets the stage, I think, for the politics, because it's the ethics that's more directly concerned with the purpose of human life and the nature of virtue. And there are kind of like two main points, two big takeaways from the selections that I've given you from the ethics. And the first one is that according to Aristotle, human happiness consists in a life of virtue, virtuous activity, guided by reason. Human happiness consists in living a life of virtuous activity, guided by reason. That's his account of happiness. The second big takeaway from reading of the Ethics is his claim at the end that the proper or highest task of government is to teach people how to live virtuous lives. So happiness consists in a life of virtue, and the highest task of government is to teach people how to live a life of virtue. Those are the main points of the ethics readings. And so now I'm going to take you through some aspects of it, beginning with happiness, right? So it's important to note, though, first of all, that Aristotle really has kind of something of a different conception of happiness than we do. In English, especially, happiness is really taken as something like a feeling. It's sort of a subjective state, like, feeling good or feeling content, right? You could say that's happiness as subjective contentment, right? I feel happy, I feel sad, right? Happiness is about feelings. That's not really Aristotle's conception of happiness. The Greek word that gets translated as happiness is eudaimonia, which almost literally means something like having a good guardian angel. So it's a bit anachronistic. It's oftentimes, eudaimonia is used synonymously with another Greek word, makaria, which means blessedness, so being fortunate. But generally, you can say like the general meaning behind the Greek word is that happiness consists in the possession and enjoyment of all the goods that are necessary to live a fully human and fully satisfying life. Right? So happiness as the possession and enjoyment of all the goods that are necessary to live a fully human, fully satisfying life. And these goods are not just external things, money and all that, but as you know, so qualities of mind and body and character as well. Happiness also encompasses those. You have to be a certain kind of person and have certain things in order to live that fully satisfying life. Another way of putting this is that happiness really consists in kind of the perfection of our nature, making of ourselves the best that we can be, each part of us. Human happiness requires putting to work everything in us that is distinctively human. A life of excellence. That's happiness in a kind of fuller, you might say, more kind of objective sense. But of course, what that means is, in order to figure out what human happiness is, you have to know what human beings need. What are the components of a truly human life? For Aristotle, like the way he goes about it in the Ethics is to try to figure out what happiness concretely consists of. You look at human nature and what Aristotle calls the human function, the human work. It's kind of an odd term. It's hard to give it any natural-sounding English translation. The closest thing you might say nowadays would be something like the meaning of life. What are we here to do? What are we supposed to do with our lives? So for Aristotle, in order to understand what happiness is, you kind of have to understand the purpose of human life. And that makes sense. And obviously, Aristotle's reflections are based on the assumption that there is a purpose to human life, that it's meaningful to say that, and that reason can discover things about it. Aristotle's not a relativist. He's not a nihilist. Now, Aristotle argues in Book 1, Chapter 7, which is on pages 4 to 5 in your packet, that the purpose of human life has to include the activity of the soul and of reason. Just bare existence, just like sleeping in your bed all day. You're a human being, but that's not really a properly human life. You're not doing anything. You're vegetating. Just bare existence and reproduction is not properly human. Plants and animals do those things. So properly, kind of a full and properly human life has to involve what is distinctive about being human, not those things that we have in common with everything else, but those things that are distinctive. Right? That's why he also says that merely seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, what he calls the life of sensation. So seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, he says that's a life that's fit for an animal. That's what animals do. They go after what feels good and they avoid what feels bad. That's for an animal. That's not for a human being. As he says in his Politics, Animals have a sense of pleasure and pain, and they express that through their cries and their grunts and things like that. But human beings have a perception not merely of the pleasant and the painful, but of the good and the bad, and the just and the unjust, right and wrong, right? And those things are kind of grasped by reason and expressed by speech, right? Right and wrong are not perceived by touch, by feelings. So there's reason that's involved there. And the possession of reason, the possession of a rational soul, is the aspect of our nature that is specifically human. And therefore, human happiness for Aristotle is going to require the use of reason, our distinctive human faculty. But of course, it will also require, as he says, virtue or excellence. A person will be most happy who not only performs the proper function of a human being, lives a proper human life, but performs it well, right? So if you know what you're supposed to do with your life, but you do a lousy job at it, you're probably not going to be happy, right? Happiness involves doing what you should with your life and doing it well. And to perform a task well, according to Aristotle, is to perform it in accordance with virtue. Now, the Greek word here is arete. That's the word that gets translated as virtue. And it doesn't mean moral virtue specifically. It's not referring simply to things like moderation or justice or all that. Arete, it means sort of excellence more generally, such that in Greek, you can talk about inanimate objects and animals also having virtues, that is, qualities that make them excellent. So, for example, if you have an axe, right, like the virtues of an axe are going to be sharpness and solidity. Why? Well, the function of an axe is to cut stuff. And so for an axe to cut, which is its purpose, its function, for an axe to cut well, it's got to be sharp, right? If it's dull, it's not going to cut. So it's got to be sharp, but it's also got to be solid. It can't break apart on impact. So sharpness and solidity are the virtues of an axe. They are the qualities that must be present in an axe for that axe to be an excellent axe. So in the same way for Aristotle, like the virtues of an ox, for example, would be strength and stamina and obedience in a harness, since an ox like that would plow better than a weak or easily winded or disobedient ox. So this is how Aristotle arrives at this conclusion that happiness is an activity of the soul, since that's where reason resides, in accordance with virtue, or in accordance with the highest or most complete virtues. So it's an activity of reason done excellently. And he adds in chapter 8, he says, of course, virtue is going to need what he calls equipment. You need external goods in order to perform virtuous actions or perform truly great actions, right? You need food, you need shelter, you need money, you need friends. There are all sorts of resources that you need. And even if those aren't the most important things in life, they need to be there. They need to be available to you in order to live a virtuous life, right? So a person who doesn't have basic health is not really going to be able to be, say, courageous on the battlefield. A person who has no money can't really be generous with their money, and so on. Now, Aristotle is not exactly saying that, for example, poor or weak people can't be happy at all, but he thinks their happiness is going to have kind of less luster. You really need those external goods and certain goods of the body and external goods in order to practice virtue well. Now, this is still a little bit vague right now. Just skipping to chapter 13 of book 1. What all of this at least entails, though, is that the proper study of politics is going to have to study virtue, since virtue is necessary for happiness. And it's going to have to study the human soul, because happiness consists in a virtuous activity involving reason and thought and the soul, not just the body. And this is why we get some comments on human nature. So, if the study of politics involves understanding human happiness, and human happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, you need to know something about the soul, and you need to know something about virtue. Right? Because otherwise, this is just going to be an abstract and useless definition of happiness. So, according to Aristotle, right, when it comes to human nature, human beings have a compound nature. We have bodies, and we have souls. And what this means is that as a human being, in our nature, we are a composite of reason and of passions, and of appetites. This is his fundamental anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? It means to be a being that has both body and soul and is endowed with reason and appetites and passions. That's what we are. There's a place where he says, a desire that thinks or a desiring thought. That's what a human being is. And later philosophers basically accept this. But so this is why on page 6, he divides virtue into two classes. There are two fundamentally different kinds of virtue: intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue involves being able to think correctly. So intellectual virtue pertains to the perfection of your reason, whereas the moral virtues involve the perfection of your appetites and your passions. Moral virtues involve acting correctly and having good character. So intellectual virtue perfects our rational nature, while moral virtue perfects our character, our emotions, our appetites, and the like. And since we're a composite of reason and passion, a good life is going to have to require an ordering and a perfecting of our reason and of our passions. It's got to do both. So intellectual virtue and moral virtue. So if happiness requires a perfection of our nature, and that means making all of our nature fit for living a properly human life, then we must attend not only to our rational nature, but to the rest of our nature too. We have to get our mind in order, yes, but we must also order our desires, our appetites, our emotions, and our passions so that they too will follow what reason dictates. So you need intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Now, as he says in the first chapter of Book 2, human beings do not spontaneously, naturally become virtuous. By nature, we have the capacity to be virtuous, but we don't automatically develop the virtues in the same way that, for example, men kind of automatically begin growing beards at a certain age, right? There are certain things that just happen to us by nature, whether we like it or not. But virtue isn't one of those things. It's not like by the time people reach the age of 21, they're necessarily virtuous in the same way that they are physically mature. So what this means then is that while by nature we have the capacity to develop the virtues, we don't necessarily realize that capacity. And that's why, as he says, we become virtuous by means of habituation, or more broadly, we become virtuous not automatically, but by means of education, right? We become brave by being taught to perform brave actions until it becomes second nature to us to be brave under the right circumstances. We become just by performing just actions until they become internalized, right? Your parents, when you were a kid, probably had to force you to share, with your siblings or with others, because little kids are kind of selfish. And so your parents had to force you to be fair, had to force you to share. And they had to force you for a while until it kind of becomes a part of your character through that sort of magic of habituation. And then it just becomes part of your nature that you share under the right circumstances instead of crying and throwing a tantrum or whatever. Some people never reach that stage. But the idea here is that you have to be formed. You have to be habituated to be a certain way. And then you kind of internalize it. That's how habituation creates virtue. And that's why Aristotle argues that one of the primary purposes of the law in a political community is to habituate citizens to perform virtuous actions. He says that on page 6. He even says that this marks the difference between a good and a bad constitution elsewhere. But as he says in Book 5, Chapter 2, which is on page 8 of your packet, the law commands the practice of every virtue and forbids the practice of any vice. And that's kind of a startling statement. That really sounds a bit more like the book of Deuteronomy than it sounds like how Americans, for example, view law today. We do not have this kind of comprehensive view of the idea that the purpose of the law is to habituate you to be a virtuous person by commanding you to do virtuous things and forbidding you from doing vicious things. That's a higher view of law than we generally have, and we might actually view that as tyrannical or authoritarian for law to try to impose that. But that's Aristotle's view, right? And as it says here, the law aims to inculcate virtue by commanding people to perform actions, right, that further the common good, and forbidding them from performing actions that hinder the common good. So you use the law to make good citizens, where good citizens are understood to be people who want to do and do actions that are good for the community. And now note, by the way, I think, Aristotle kind of leaves open here whether the law can truly inculcate every virtue, right? The government and the law considers virtue with respect to the common good and with respect to deeds performed for the common good. So laws might be able to make you courageous. Laws might be able to habituate you to be moderate, self-controlled, honest, obedient, and all those sorts of things. But can laws make you wise? Not necessarily. So there might be elements of human virtue that are not really the province of the law. But with the moral virtues, there are. And just to add to this, also in chapter 6 of book 2, remember, Aristotle also says that moral virtue is a mean, like a middling thing. And he doesn't mean that virtue is mediocre. What he means by that is that every virtue lies in a sense between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And so to be virtuous means to do, kind of like just the right thing, no more, no less. Just give a few examples from book 2, chapter 7. I focused on a couple of the cardinal virtues. So, for example, he talks about courage. Courage, for example, he says, is a mean between cowardice, where you've got too much fear, and recklessness, where you don't have enough fear. Right? So to be courageous doesn't just mean to be kind of crazy, willing to risk everything for any cause. Courage has to be rational, and that means, well, you have to be able to bear pain and fear when it's appropriate. Courage is not simply absence of fear. It's knowing when fear should be obeyed and when fear should be overridden so that you do what you should do. Right? So part of courage is having the proper amount of fear in a situation and being able to do the right thing even when it makes you afraid to do it. So in the same way, he talks about temperance or moderation as the mean between self-indulgence, which is wanting too much pleasure too often, and insensibility, which is a kind of a rare condition for human beings, but where people are kind of abnormally insensitive to pleasure. Right? Moderation or temperance more or less consists in keeping your various appetites and desires under the rule of reason, not pursuing every pleasure, but not eschewing every pleasure either, but indulging in those pleasures which it is good for you to indulge, and refraining from those that are not good. Right? And you can see how kind of courage and temperance are really about, and certainly about pain and pleasure. Courage is about having the proper stance towards pain, really, or fear of pain. Whereas moderation or temperance is about having the proper stance towards pleasure or the prospects of pleasure. And those are two important, since pleasure and pain are important in human life. These are very important virtues. Now, there are others, for example, justice, which consists more or less in rendering to each what is due to them. And that's a mean between not rendering people enough of what you owe them or giving them too much or what have you. But so for Aristotle, these are three of the most important virtues for any human being. Is justice, which regulates their activity towards others; temperance or moderation, which regulates your conduct with respect to pleasure; and courage, which regulates your, or fortitude, as it sometimes gets translated, which regulates your sort of the way you approach the prospect of pain and fear. So now just one other kind of aspect of the ethics, and that'll be the end of this lecture. So remember, the first big takeaway from this lecture is that according to Aristotle, happiness consists of a life of virtuous activity. And now we've seen some of these main virtues, that human beings are a composite. They have bodies, they have souls, and as a result, they have reason, but they also have passions and appetites. So a good human life is going to involve perfecting both your reason and your character through developing virtues that you have to be habituated into, but through education or formation, acquiring the virtues that help you to think well and the ones that help you to act well. That's really, and that's the way you perfect your nature. And this is why, as he argues in chapter 9 of book 10, the last part from the ethics that I assigned, that politics has to be concerned with teaching people to be virtuous. Right? Aristotle ends the ethics by saying that the study of ethics is only complete when it is complemented by a study of politics. Why? Well, because the purpose of ethics is not simply to know about the virtues, right? The purpose of ethics is to be virtuous. And just reading a book about the virtues is not sufficient to make a person virtuous. In the same way that like reading a diet book doesn't cause you to lose weight. You've got to do what's in the book. You have to put the principles into practice. So ultimately, ethics is about acting better. And Aristotle says most people need the encouragement of the law in order to become virtuous. To be blunt, he says, most people are more concerned with pleasure and pain than they are with being virtuous for its own sake. And what that means then is that you've got to appeal to pleasure and pain in a way that forces them to become virtuous. So in other words, they've got to be punished for being vicious. Right? And by appealing to the fear of pain, the fear of punishment, they are induced to act virtuously, with the hope that they will eventually become genuinely virtuous and moral for their own sake. So again, this is called a paternalistic view of politics because the government acts towards citizens in a manner very similar to how parents act towards children, right? Because parents don't just give children advice about how to live. Parents give commands to children and punish children for doing the wrong thing. And you punish children as a way of trying to induce them to do the right thing next time. You're like, well, okay, if you're not going to do the right thing for its own sake, then do the right thing because you don't want to be punished. And the hope is that if you can appeal to that fear of pain, over time you can actually habituate people so that they're good for its own sake. And you do see that with children, right? In the first place, children have to be forced to share under threat of punishment. And then most children at a certain point become more generous, just of their own accord. That's the kind of habituation that parents do. And Aristotle thinks more generally that's what politics should do with citizens, should make laws that punish vice and encourage virtue. Right? And he thinks, therefore, that for most human beings, since pleasure and pain are so powerful in human life, the law needs to counteract that by creating good habits. And what this means then is that human beings, they really have the best chance to become virtuous and hence happy, according to him, live a fully human life, if they're brought up under good laws, under laws that instill the right habits by commanding and forbidding actions in the light of virtue. Right? So your best chance at living a good life is to live under good laws that give you good habits, that give you the virtues. And that's why rule of law is important, according to Aristotle. Maybe he thinks, some people can be good, they can figure out how to be good on their own. Some people don't need the law. Some people don't need much education at the hands of others. They can really figure things out for themselves. But those people are pretty rare. And everybody else, they need help. And they can get it through the commands of good laws and good customs. This Greek word nomos can mean law or custom, these sort of like authoritative rules of the community. Right? Most people need the help of that in order to become virtuous. They can't do it on their own. And so what this then means overall for Aristotle is that anyone who wants to be involved in politics, anyone who wants to serve the common good, has to know not only about virtue, but also about what kinds of laws and what kinds of institutions are most effective in instilling virtue. Right? And this is why he transitions in the ethics, he transitions to the study of politics, because he basically says, if happiness requires virtue and virtue requires habituation, and the best way to habituate people to be virtuous is through living under good laws, then we have to understand what kinds of political orders are likely to provide good laws. right? So what are the good laws and what kind of political order is most effective at creating laws that are good for creating virtuous citizens? And of course, we know, spoiler alert, the answer is aristocracy, the rule of the virtuous too. But that's what we'll get to in the next lecture, which will be on Aristotle's politics. So this concludes the lecture on Aristotle's ethics, the two main points of which are that for Aristotle, happiness consists in a life of virtuous activity guided by reason, and that the proper end of politics is, by means of laws and institutions, to teach people how to be virtuous and therefore happy. In the next lecture, we'll talk about Aristotle's politics.